Up to this point in our discussion of energy and resources in living systems, we've only considered this theme from the perspective of a single species. Now, I don't mean by this that we've only looked at one particular species. Instead, what I mean is we've only considered one species at a time. For example, when we looked at factors that affect the size and growth of populations, we implicitly assumed that a population of one species would be completely unaffected by populations of other species that happen to be found in the same area. Similarly, when we considered how individuals in a population interact with each other in our discussion of behavioral ecology, we implicitly assumed that the only individuals that mattered were individuals of the same species. In other words, up to this point in our discussion, we've assumed that species that happen to overlap in their habitats don't interact in any way that would affect each other's density or distribution or behavior. More often than not, however, this assumption is not met, and the distribution and abundance and behavior of a species depends not only on the resources that are critical for that particular species, but also on the distribution and abundance of other species that coexist with it. In today's lecture, we're going to move beyond this assumption as we begin to consider the implications of energy and resources in living systems at the levels of communities. Now, by community, I simply mean an assemblage of species that live in the same area and that have the potential to interact. We refer to the study of biological communities as community ecology, and this is going to be the area we explore over the next few lectures. As we'll see, the most important interactions among species in a community also have to do with resources, either because two species share a similar set of resources or because one species uses another species as a resource. There are a variety of ways in which the interactions an organism may have with individuals of other species can influence abundance and distribution of populations. Now, a convenient way to consider these different kinds of interactions between species is to group them into a few major types according to whether they have a positive or a negative effect on one or the other species of the two species that are interacting. This way of thinking about interactions between species is conceptually similar to the way we categorize social interactions among individuals, when we discussed how these interactions may be classified according to whether they resulted in a benefit or a cost to each of the two interacting individuals. We'll add a few more combinations here, however, since we're going to include the possibility that the presence of one species actually does have no effect on another species, at least as a null hypothesis. Now, we can begin, in fact, by considering the hypothetical case in which neither species of two species in the same area, where neither species actually does have an effect on each other. I mean, this is the case that corresponds to the general assumption we're challenging right now, but it is certainly a possibility that two species that happen to be in the same place really don't influence each other at all. We can imagine examples of that, and the difficulty is to actually demonstrate that there is no interaction, especially that there's no indirect interaction. I mean, imagine amoebas in an area and elephants in an area. How could those two species possibly interact? Well, maybe not directly. Maybe they're not interacting over resources or eating one another. But on the other hand, there may be indirect interactions that somehow link the population of one species to the population of another. And it's very difficult to rule out these kinds of indirect interactions. Well, let's consider some more obvious kinds of interactions that can occur between species. Let's consider the case, for example, in which two species interact in a way that is actually harmful to each other. In other words, the presence of two species in an area actually is detrimental to each of those two species. This type of interaction we call competition. And it occurs most commonly when two species do use some of the same resources, and those resources are limited. Now, we've been introduced to the idea of competition already when we talked about the logistic growth model of population growth, because this logistic model essentially is a model of intraspecific competition, that is, competition among individuals of the same species. Ultimately, it's this intraspecific competition that's responsible for the existing of the carrying capacity of a particular species in a population. Well, we can extend this idea when we think of the fact that two species may in fact share at least some of the same resources. So the carrying capacity of either species actually is going to be lower, because that one species alone is not the only species that is gaining access and using the resources available. Well, now, yet another kind of possible interaction that can occur between two species is when individuals of one species benefit from being in proximity to the other species, but individuals of that second species actually are harmed by the interaction. This usually happens when one species is either a predator of the other species or a parasite of the other species. So we refer to this kind of interaction as a predator-prey interaction, or sometimes we might call it a host-parasite interaction. As we'll see later on, competition and predator-prey interactions, or host-parasite interactions, are particularly important kinds of ecological interactions between species. Particularly important because they seem to have a preponderant effect on the way that species in communities are distributed, and effect on the abundance and distribution, I should say, of different species in a community. And we're going to look at these two kinds of interactions in more detail in a little while, predation and competition. But first I want to turn to some other kinds of interactions that can occur between species that don't involve competition for the same resource or one species essentially eating the other species. Now, in some cases of interactions between individuals of two species, individuals of both species might benefit from that interaction. We call these species mutualists, and we call their interaction mutualism. Now, mutualistic interactions, or mutualisms, are very commonly found in nature. Let me give you an example that is really very well known and that you might be familiar with. This is an example of cellulose-digesting bacteria that live in the guts of termites. Now, cellulose is a polymer of simple sugars, and as such, it's potentially a very tremendous source of organic material that can be used by organisms as a fuel for cellular respiration to make more ATP. But cellulose is a very stable form, form of carbohydrate, or a stable polymer of sugar. And most animals can't digest it because they lack enzymes that can break down this polymer into simpler sugar molecules. So if you or I eat cellulose, it just passes on through. We can't break it down. We can't gain access to that energy stored within it. On the other hand, there are some species of bacteria that do possess enzymes to break down cellulose. These are cellulose-digesting bacteria. It turns out that there are other organisms we're familiar with that also can digest cellulose, and the particular one I mentioned are termites. Now, we know termites digest cellulose because we pay a heck of a lot of money in general to prevent our houses, which are made of cellulose, wood, from being eaten by termites. Well, termites themselves are unable to digest cellulose, but they have cellulose-digesting bacteria that live permanently in their guts. The termites eat the cellulose, but it's the bacteria in their guts that actually digest the cellulose. Well, now, let's ask ourselves, what do these two species get out of this interaction? Well, clearly the termites benefit, because although some of the cellulose they eat is taken in by the bacteria for their own needs, the bacteria, by breaking down all of the cellulose, make a lot of energy available to the termite that it couldn't otherwise gain access to. So clearly the termite is benefiting from this interaction. Well, what about the bacteria? Well, what the bacteria is getting out of this is essentially a free ride. It doesn't have to go anywhere. It's living in the stomach of the termite, who brings to it essentially a constant supply of cellulose. So both the bacteria and the termite benefit from this particular interaction between two species. Interestingly, this interaction is an obligatory interaction. In other words, the termites have to have cellulose-digesting bacteria in their gut, and there are certain bacteria that only live in the guts of animals. So we refer to this as these species as obligate mutualists. There are other examples of mutualism where, in fact, the species may or may not interact to each own's benefit, and we call these facultative mutualists. Well, let's look at another example of a kind of interaction between species. Let's consider the case where members of one species benefit from the presence of another species, but that second species is unaffected by the interaction. we refer to this kind of ecological interaction between two species as commensalism. Now, cases of commensalism are a little bit more difficult to identify, and this is because, as I said earlier, it's hard to prove that there's absolutely no cost or benefit to one of the species. But I can give you an example of an interaction that is often cited as a commensalism, and this is an interaction between a kind of bird called the cattle egret and grazing cattle. Now, what you find is that egrets forage almost exclusively near grazing cattle. In fact, historical changes in the species range of the cattle egret can be related to changes in the distribution of cattle as they become farmed more and more widely. Now, the egrets benefit from their association with cattle because as the cattle move through the fields, they flush up insects, they disturb the environment, and in so doing, expose food that the egrets will take advantage of. So egrets literally are following the cattle around, picking up the food that the cattle essentially kick up. Well, what do the cattle get out of this interaction? Well, apparently the cattle don't get anything out of this interaction. The presence or absence of egrets doesn't seem to have any effect at all on the well-being or on the detriment of the or to the detriment of the cattle. Well, finally, another kind of interaction that I want to mention is the case in which one species is harmed by its interaction with another, but the second species is again unaffected. We call this kind of interaction, ecological interaction, amensalism. Now, amensalism is often hard to identify. In fact, some authors question whether any real cases of amensalism really have been documented. It's hard to identify again because it's hard to demonstrate that one species doesn't have any effect on the other species one way or the other. But I want to include amensalism on our list of ecological interactions because it fills out the theoretical possibilities of the way that species might interact, positive or negative, with respect to each other. Now let me give you an example of something that I think we could call an amensal interaction. Large mammals often congregate around sources of water, drinking holes. You see this, for example, with large African mammals that are congregated around watering holes that are the only sources of water for miles and miles around. You might have seen this on TV, or perhaps you've been lucky enough to actually go to Africa and see this yourself. Now, because these large mammals are aggregating in numbers around watering holes, you can imagine that they really trample the ground around these watering holes. But there are particular species of plants that are specialized in living around the moist edges of these watering holes. The presence of these large mammals obviously has a very, very negative impact on the plants that are around the watering hole. Well, the plants themselves don't affect these mammals at all. The mammals are benefiting only from the presence of the water. The fact that there happen to be plants underfoot is neither here nor there to these mammals. So in this case, the fact that the mammals and the plants are existing in the same place has a negative impact on the plants, but no impact of the plants on the mammals themselves. It's an example, I would say, of an amensal relationship. Actually, it may be that we could characterize the relationship that we have as humans with a profound effect on the biosphere around us, the fact that we have on many of the plants and animals with which we interact indirectly. In spite of ourselves, the presence of the human species has a negative impact on many other species. We don't necessarily benefit or suffer, at least in the short term, from this interaction, but the species with whom we interact clearly can suffer a detriment. Well, this list of kinds of ecological interactions between two species provides a framework for thinking about how different species living in a community may interact with each other and thus influence each other's population size and population structure. As I said before, two of these kinds of interactions, predation and competition, are considered to have a much more pervasive influence on the structure of communities. And so what we're going to do is to look at these kinds of interactions in just a little bit more detail. Let's first look at the ecological consequences of predator-prey interactions. Now, the interactions between predators and their prey And the consequences of these interactions really have been the consequences of these interactions for the structure of communities really have been a major focus for ecological research for many, many years. In general terms, I want to give you in general terms how we might think about the relationship between a predator and a prey and how they affect each other's populations. And this is the way I want to start to look at this. Consider what happens when a predator captures and eats one prey species. Well, if we're just counting numbers, then clearly the population size of the prey species has gone down by 1 from this interaction. Now, the resources that the predator has gotten from this interaction, eating the prey, clearly will contribute to an increase in the size of the predator population. Now, there's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship here. In fact, there's very unlikely a one-to-one relationship. So a predator may have to eat a number of prey before the resources would contribute to one additional predator. But nonetheless, any prey that is eaten by a predator takes some of the reduces the population size of the prey species and ultimately will contribute to increasing the population size of the predator species. Now, from this you might predict that as the size of the predator species, the predator population increases, the size of the prey population should correspondingly decrease. This has to be true to some extent. As there are more and more predators, they're going to eat more and more prey. The more prey that are eaten, the fewer prey will be around. And the more prey that are eaten, the more predators will ultimately be born, and the more predators will be around. But clearly this kind of interaction can't go on forever. Now, to make that point clear, let's consider a hypothetical case where there are really only 2 species in a particular environment, one a predator and one a prey. And let's begin by considering this situation from the point of view of the predator. An individual predator, in order to maintain itself and reproduce, needs to find a certain number of prey species to gain resources and energy from. Okay? That is to say, it needs to eat a certain number of prey individuals per unit time in order to satisfy its resource needs. If the predators don't find enough prey, then they may starve, or at least they may not reproduce as much. Now, let's take as a starting point a situation where we have a population of prey that's large enough so that it can sustain the predators with which it's associated with on average. In other words, the predators have no difficulty finding enough prey to eat. Because the predators have enough resources, the predator population is going to be expected to increase. They're able to eat the prey, the population size goes up. However, the increased number of predators will increase the per capita death rate of the prey species. The more predators, the more prey will be taken, the higher the per capita death rate of the prey species. Thus, the population size of the prey will decrease, as we would expect, because they're eaten. And they're eaten at an ever-increasing rate as the number of predators increase. Now, at some point in time, the number of predators will have increased and the number of prey will have decreased to the point at which predators can no longer find sufficient prey to satisfy their resource needs. When predators can no longer find sufficient prey, they will reproduce less well, and they will survive less well. Per capita death rate now in the predators will go up, and per capita birth rate in the predators will go down. At this point, we'd now predict that the population size of the predator species will begin to decrease. Well, now, as the population size of the predator species decreases, predation will also decrease. In other words, the relative death rate of the prey species will begin to diminish because now there are fewer predators. And as there are fewer and fewer predators, then the population size of the prey species will begin to increase again. Now, you can imagine that as the prey species increases enough, the predators will again begin to be able to find sufficient resources to meet their needs. And as a result, the population size of the predator species will increase. But you can see where this is going, because as the population size of the predator species increases, again, the death rate of the prey will increase and the population size of the prey will go down. As the population size of the prey goes down, again, you'd expect the population size of the predator would go down. What you would predict is a cyclic pattern of dynamic population changes with oscillations in the size of the predator and prey population following each other, with increases and decreases in the prey population being followed by a lagging increase and decrease in the predator population. We call these kinds of oscillating cycles predator-prey cycles. Now, interestingly, predator-prey cycles have been observed both in the laboratory and in the wild, and I want to give you a couple examples to show you what they, or to describe for you what they look like. Now, the first case I want to describe for you comes from a detailed study of a population of moose that live on Isle Royale, which is a large isolated island in the middle of northern Lake Superior. Now, the moose on Isle Royale had been living free of any predators that could take them since at least near the beginning of the 20th century, maybe longer. Then, in 1949, there was a particularly cold winter and Lake Superior froze enough to allow for an ice bridge between the mainland and Isle Royale, and a few wolves crossed that ice bridge and started a new population of wolves on the island. This introduction of wolves essentially began a kind of natural experiment, since the moose was the only prey that the wolves would take, and the wolves were the only predator on the moose. So we essentially have the situation I described before, with two species, one the predator and one the prey. Now, it turns out, fortunately, that the population sizes of both the moose and the wolf populations on Isle Royale began to be monitored regularly in about 1958. And so biologists could follow changes in these populations over time. Now, what happened is that after the introduction of wolves to Isle Royale, the population sizes of both of these two species began to oscillate. Now, the moose population was on the rise when this first happened, and it continued to increase. The moose population continued to increase over a period of about 50 years. And as the moose population increased, so too did the wolf population, more or less. I mean, with a few ups and downs. But there were plenty of moose around, and so the wolves began to multiply quite a bit, and the wolf population went up. But as the wolf population grew very large, there was a subsequent decrease in the moose population. This decrease was presumably due to the fact that the increased numbers of wolves meant that more moose were being eaten. In fact, probably it was mostly moose babies that were being eaten by these wolves. This resulting decrease in the moose population was then followed by a corresponding decrease in the wolf population. Again, presumably because there were no longer sufficient numbers of moose to sustain as high a population level of the wolves. And so the wolf population followed a downward trajectory, following in a lagging fashion the downward trajectory of the moose population. Well, what do you imagine happened next? Well, when the wolf population got down to a certain low level, the moose population started rising again. There were fewer predators, the moose were able to reproduce more, and we now had more moose around. And finally, what you would have predicted is that as the moose population started to rise, you might have expected that the wolf population would start to rise as well. Actually, it didn't happen quite that way on Isle Royale. Now, this is a very long cycle. I mean, we're talking about a cycle that's lasting decades before we observe an up and down oscillation, not years or months. And so maybe we will eventually see another oscillation occurring on this. But what happened was, in the 1980s, the wolf population crashed to a very, very low level. And it really never recovered from this population crash. The reason for this population crash was probably the appearance of a viral disease that infected the wolf population on the island. This viral disease led to a very high mortality rate, and the wolves have not recovered from this yet, and may in fact go locally extinct on the island. Well, that's an example of something that looks like a predator-prey cycle in the case of moose and wolves on Isle Royale. Let me give you another example to think about, another example of a predator-prey cycle. This actually is perhaps the best known example of a predator-prey cycle that's been studied, and it's one that's been described for populations of snowshoe hares and its predator, the lynx, which is a kind of wild cat in Canada. Now, the data for studying these population cycles actually comes from a very interesting source. It turns out that these data come from records that extend over almost a century of the number of pelts taken by fur trappers working for the Hudson Bay Company. These trappers were going out and basically catching as many snowshoe hares and as many lynxes as they could, but in so doing, they were effectively getting a statistical estimate of the relative sizes of these populations. You can imagine as there's more snowshoe hares around, the number of pelts that can be taken by the trappers increases, and as there are fewer snowshoe hares around, there would be fewer pelts taken by the trappers. Now, if you plot the changes in population size of snowshoe hares and lynxes over a period of, 75 or more years, what you see is a very strong cyclic fluctuation in both populations that cycles on about a 9 to 11 year period. That is, about every 9 to 11 years, you see an increase and decrease in the population size of both of these species. And in fact, you also see that the changes in the population size of the predator species, the lynx, lags behind the changes in the population size of the prey species, the snowshoe hare. This is just what we would predict given the verbal model I presented earlier of how predators and prey might interact and how this interaction could affect the population size of both species. The increases and the decreases of the snowshoe hare population are followed by corresponding increases and decreases of their predator, the lynx. Well, the population data for snowshoe hares and lynxes used to be actually cited as the best evidence that predator-prey interactions led to cyclic changes in populations in wild populations of animals. But more recently, there's been a very important caveat to add to how we interpret these data. Specifically, there are other ways to interpret these data, or I should say another way, other kinds of causes that could yield these population cycles. Now, the problem with interpreting the hare-lynx data comes from the fact that after these data had been looked at carefully, other people went and looked at changes in population sizes of snowshoe hare populations in places where lynxes or other predators didn't occur. And when they did that, they found that, in fact, the snowshoe hare populations would still show a regular 9 to 11 year cyclic fluctuation. Well, this is clearly a problem for interpreting this cycle as something to do with an interaction between the predator, the lynx, and the prey, because the predator is simply absent in these cases, and yet the cycle still appears. Well, a possibility that might account for why the hare shows this cycle could actually have to do with the fact that the relationship between predator and prey here is not exactly what was first imagined. In fact, what could be happening in this case instead is that we should consider the hare as a predator on the plants it eats, the grasses and other plants that it eats, so that as the population size of the hare increases, the population size of its food plant decreases. So we're really sort of shifting the predator-prey relationship. Now, in this case, we would interpret the changes in the lynx population as indeed following the hare populations, but not actually driving changes in the hare population. You can test this idea experimentally, and let me quickly describe for you one way in which it's been tested. And this was done by taking snowshoe hares and keeping them in enclosures, where you could manipulate various parameters in those enclosures, specifically where you could manipulate the amount of food available, the quality of food available, and the presence or absence of predators. So in some enclosures, you might add more food. In other enclosures, you might add fertilizer to make the food that's in there higher quality, and in yet other enclosures, you might actually separate these enclosures off from the rest of the world with something like an electric fence so the predators simply can't get in. When you do this kind of experiment, what you find is that just adding food to an enclosure does indeed increase the population density of hares in that enclosure a little bit, not a lot. Excluding predators from that enclosure, again, increases the population density of hares. Now, this is just evidence that suggests that these two factors, amount of food available and presence or absence of predators, might affect the density of a hare population. Interestingly enough, if you have a treatment in which you both supplement the hares with more food and exclude predators, then you get the most dramatic change in the size of the hare population in that enclosure. These data suggest that actually in the interaction between hares and their food plants and hares and the predators that eat them, there's really a more complex synergistic interaction, so that we have these cycles emerging from an interaction of more than just one or two species, but in fact a set of a species, or a set of three species in this case. And the implication then of this is that when we consider the population dynamics and population structures of species in a more complex community than just a two-species community that we might hypothetically think of, that we will see a more complex set of dynamics emerging. This is the kind of issue that we're going to turn to in the next lecture as we look in a little more detail at how ecological interactions affect the abundance and distribution of different species in a community.